hand up and I'll pick one in. So I'd like to introduce Alan Cadwallader. He's the adjunct associate professor at the Centre for Religion, Ethics and Society at Charles Sturt University in Canberra, which means he tells me that he's retired, but he works too hard to be retired, I think. So because he's just always writing. He's contributed an enormous amount of scholarship on Colossae, and I think he's probably one of the world's leaders on Colossae and the letter to the Colossians. So we're very fortunate to have him today. His latest work is an enormous tome called Colossae, Colossians, Philemon, and it's in the Studien zur Umwelt des Neuen Testaments series. I hope I got that right. He's also been the editor of a volume with Jim Harrison and Larry Wellborn called A Village in Antiquity and the Rise of Early Christianity, which looks fantastic. And this always stirs my heart because I live out in the country and they have a little farm. They keep alpacas and chooks. And I keep chooks too. So over to my fellow chook keeper.
Thanks, Lynn. That's great. Good. All right. Let's go. Oh, yes, there's handouts going around, coins on one side, Roman names and citizens on the other. Going okay? Good. The Roman Empire, as the broad context within which the writings of the New Testament were composed, may appear to be a banal observation. But the contested rise of counter-imperial criticism in the last 3 decades has witnessed a heat and at times an absence of light that have torn at the hermetic seal previously erected between these texts and Roman imperial hegemony. The binary partition, exemplified by Tom Wright on one side and John Barclay on the other, that has characterised the initial cartography of the debate, especially as regards the Pauline corpus, has begun to give way to a more nuanced, multi-layered approach, both at the level of method and at the level of the harvesting of material sources. The convenient but contested heuristic umbrella for this exploration is Romanization. But from the beginning, any sense of an undifferentiated entity, program or process has been eschewed. The empire was neither monolithic in its impact throughout its territory, nor monolithic in the responses that it engendered. The difference in currency systems between East and West is a very obvious example, but even here, the difference between Eastern mints, for example, Rhodes, and many of the other cities that were mints, compared to those mints, particularly their heavy use of portraits of the imperial family, demonstrates that there was a kaleidoscope of negotiations and responses to the fluid presence of Roman authority in pre-existing regions and city-states. In the Roman province of Asia, where Colossae stood as one of the eastern portals to provinces further east, that authority was almost always filtered and gradated through local entities. Whatever commonalities were required for congenial existence in and under senatorial and imperial governance, local distinctives, aspirations, and connections provided the primary frame determining the experience of Rome. The notoriously limited to date material remains of Colossae demand a broader sweep than the usual confines of epigraphy, numismatics, and papyrology. But equally notorious has been the failure to assemble the evidence we do have, with some notable recent exceptions, as the foundation from which and to which comparanda might then be summoned. So to Romanisation. At its most rudimentary, the heuristic category Romanisation indicates the imposition of Roman state control that led to the cultural change. But increasingly, Romanisation cannot be understood as monolithic or assigned a specific chronological intervention. It's far more complex than imposing simply a foreign culture onto a native one. Romanisation is a process, often ad hoc, often subject to a specific emperor's agendas, and often contending with or content to accommodate local cultures and practices. Equally important for assessment, because embroiling of the Roman processes is the continued hold of local cultural distinctives, intercity competition, and territorial sensitivities. From the outset, there is a qualification that must be made on any attempt to read Colossians as a complete subversion of empire, as one hermeneutical commentary tries to establish. Strikingly interesting in this particular commentary, devoid of any reference to the specific culture of that city. Empire here becomes the singular construct in an attempt to address a post-2001 globalized world. For an ordinary Colossian inhabitant, if such can be posited, there were likely to be manifold occasions when Rome had little recognition in day-to-day living. Even when Rome was more visible, it was generally filtered through local channels, from the overarching council, the bullae, that's the council, decision-making that facilitated Roman policies, to the Greek athletic valorization of that decidedly Roman soft manipulation that we call the spectacles, especially gladiators. I hope to visit 5 assemblages of evidence today without suggesting these are the only ones available. The first is Romanization and hierarchization. I know it's a terrible word, with its indebtedness to the work of Stanislav Dmitriev, with a sidelong glance towards associations in Colossian life, given Benedict Eckhart's insights into Roman interest in group life, but with some correctives from the Colossian evidence. Then I want to look at Romanization, hierarchization, and coinage as being particularly revealing of the delicate relationship between Roman rule and polis social capital. And finally, governance and Roman interventions takes the insights gained from the numismatic study into the hints at the plurality, if not conflict, of laws at Colossae, and then, last of all, to the detailed study of onomastics and the variety of citizenships displayed in civic and territorial disputes. Now, I recognise that any one of those we could have spent all the time on. Anyway, to hierarchization. A letter of Antoninus Pius to the koinon of the province of Asia, that is the collective body of the cities of Asia, survives in the digest of Justinian, courtesy of the record in Greek that was made by the 3rd century jurist Modestinus. It demonstrates the structural reinforcement of a tripartite hierarchy in the Roman administration of its provinces, and specifically, it required the involvement of the bullae, the council, in its execution in each of the 3 levels of cities. The status levels accorded cities were no novelty introduced by Antoninus, The geographer Strabo recorded the tripartite breakdown of city voting rights in the Lycian League. But Rome added wide-ranging gradations that included not only cities in relationship to each other, especially as regards the presence or absence of Roman courts, but also tax, liturgy-exempt civic officers, such as doctors, rhetoricians, and grammarians, numerically assigned according to city status, as Modestinus noted, although he did add that it was also built on population size. There were pecuniary benefits that attached to these status levels for both cities and individuals, dependent nonetheless on continued loyalty to and mimesis of Rome. This hierarchy is amply demonstrated between Ephesus and Laodicea in a 3rd century letter of a Praetorian legate, Marcus Ulpius Lurus, to the city of Laodicea. He writes of travel from Ephesus to your most illustrious city. Ephesus is designated not only metropolis, but also the seat of judges. Two contrasting emphases in numismatic evidence corroborate the hierarchical differentiation between Laodicea as Assize centre, subject to Ephesus, and eager for its own metropolitical status, and Colossae as, in Roman terms, a city without courts, that is, without a Roman judicial centre. The first is the monumental iconography in Laodicean coins that is yet completely absent from any of Colossai's currency. Rather, Colossae, 3rd in the ranking of Conventus division of Asian cities below Ephesus and Laodicea, emphasises rather its ancestral riches of a fecund natural environment. Laodicea has no boar, except as the personification of the river Capros with the wolf for the river Lycos, just as Colossae does. And the only Artemis on Laodicea's coins is the sedentary Artemis Ephesiaca. Even deities with headdresses on Colossai's coins, Serapis, Artemis, possibly Demeter, are calathic, that is, speaking of fecundity rather than the city walls. There's one exception to that, and that's a Homonoia coin with Aphrodisias. At Laodicea, by contrast, Artemis Ephesiaca manages to balance a headdress that holds at its very top a temple. Where did you get that hat? Colossae privileges a pastoral dimension, and this appears to be reflected in the letter to the Colossians with its use of agricultural imagery in Colossians 1, 6 and 10. There is also the epigraphical evidence pointing to the hierarchy existing between cities of the Lycus Valley. First is the recently published water regulation, a decision of the proconsul of Asia that protected the water usage of Laodicea from springs up in the hills that belonged to other cities. Colossae is not explicitly mentioned, but the use of uplands language draws attention to the Taurus Ranges, substantially the territory belonging to Colossae to the east and Atuda to the west. The imperial privileging of the Conventus Centre is similarly demonstrated in the Hadrianic fishing edict, that's that one there, that accorded piscatorial harvesting rights in the Lycus Valley, the Lycus Valley Lake, to Laodicea over Hierapolis and Tripolis. This macro dimension of hierarchy was mirrored in miniature with an increased proliferation of the prefixes, sometimes suffixes. The two are archi, chief, proto, first, especially for civic officials. It's clear that these are not nominal honorifics. as has sometimes been suggested for the familiar archasynagogos of the Gospels, as in Mark 5:22, but rather that what we have here is a multiplication of articulated tiers of hierarchy. A clear example is an ergasteriarches, the head of a weaving workshop where many other workers worked. This hierarchization, as Dmitriev dubs Rome's intensification of civic gradations, is glimpsed at Colossae. In a critical late 1st or early 2nd century example not given by Dmitriev. I avoid here engagement with the extensive arguments that have been mounted about this honorific pedestal inscription for Marcos, the archermeneos kai exegetes, the chief interpreter and translator of or for the Colossians. But a recently published second honorific for a chief interpreter named Hierarchus from Phanagoria on the Black Sea that combines his position with supervisor of the royal court along with being chief interpreter strongly suggests a multi-staffed office. So Marcos in Colossae and Hierarchus in Phanagoria likely had multiple people under them, warranting the use of archi in their inscriptions. Regardless of whether commercial or legal necessities drove the expansion of this Colossian bureaucracy or a combination of the two, this inscription is a snippet at the local level of the hierarchization accumulating through Roman imperial administration. Dmitriev's brief aside that this hierarchization of positions was replicated in some associations finds an expansion in Benedict Eckart's analysis of the generation of association structures and positions that were mimetic of civic administration. He calls it an isomorphism. It was generally not imposed, but it was a real emulation, a real desire to imitate what they saw in the larger frame. Recognized groups delivered recognition and influence, as we see clearly in the inscribed place markers for groups on the pavement of the Agora at Magnesia on Meander. If you've not visited that, what they actually have in the Agora, they have inscribed in the stones the topoi for each of the associations, so that when there was a civic gathering, you had your set place. So you were designated. Oh, and by the way, there is a women's one there. Yeah, they're not totally invisible. All right. So there was an incentive to organise, to become multipliers of the order filtering from above. Indeed, as the famous Fishing Association dedication at Ephesus shows, thanks to Greg Horsley, associations readily contributed to that order. And you can't get more ordered or loyal than providing a tax office for someone to tax you for fishing. It might help one's standing to be recognised as a collegia licita, an official civic sanction based on Roman models. But Eckhart chose Phrygia as his focus because he was concerned to discover associations reflecting more epichoric, more native traditions. That is, those less influenced by Roman or civic filtered Roman promotions. Thus, he adopted a serviceable division between professional and cultic associations. Unfortunately, Colossae lost out in consideration. Others have said there's 2 or 3 associations that they can identify at Colossae, maybe. But I'd like to resurrect this one, dated variously, if not particularly helpfully, between the 1st and 3rd centuries. The key inscription is funerary. It's cut somewhat crudely onto a relief. Crucial here is close attention to both the lithographic phenomena and the details of relief. Graham Oliver directs us here. He says, if one wishes to understand the function of epigraphy in its wider historical and cultural context, one will not be served well by the isolation of an epigraphical text from its own physical context. The superscript edition, just here, of the definite article before heteiroi is particularly significant in swinging the argument to acceptance of a cultic association, especially with the further use of etoimesan at the end, rather than what you would normally expect from an epitaph, a Menaeus Karin. Yet in combination with the Kitra, where's the up there, and the rosette, we obviously have a funerary monument going on here. But the relief adds a further insight. Rather than being husband and wife, as Eckhart took it, a cultic connection is evoked for the crinkled garment, and if you want to know more about that, read Rosemary's book, and the turban on the figure on the left. Now, I'm still in debate about whether it's a woman or a man, but I'm happy to take ideas from that. But what I suggest is that, in fact, the Greek understanding of associations is crucial here. It's preserved in the digest and credited by the 2nd century Roman jurist Gaius to Solon, probably wrongly. Gaius understood that the Greek hetaireia, that is the club of hetairoi, was the equivalent of the Latin collegium. This Colossian inscription with defining relief fulfills key elements of the Greek definition, namely an association for collegial, cultic, and funerary purposes. Hence, however much a recognisable group might fulfil Roman interests, this is an association with a decidedly Greek colouring, one with no demonstrable hierarchy. Any asserted Romanization is no more than unwitting coherence with larger Roman promotions. And to coinage. This is where the sheet will become important. The 2nd century re-establishment of the Colossian mint provides a crucial array of evidence for how a small city negotiated its relationship with Rome, but also promoted its independence from other cities and their coinage. The 21 coin types minted in the first flush of mintings during the reign of Hadrian roughly break down into the 5 basic values necessary for daily transactions, with 1 or 2 additions, themselves significant. George Watson, in a wonderful book published in 2019, gives an imprecise but serviceable sense of the general range of values in provincial bronzes necessary for commercial transactions. And he has the highly technical breakdown into very large, large, medium, small, and very small. This hierarchy of size values is also reflected in the iconography assigned to the coins, with the 2 highest valued coins recognizing the emperor or imperial family or imperial institution on their obverses, and the 2 lowest value coins containing no recognition of Rome on obverse or reverse, apart from, in this particular case, the citizenship formula retained by Claudia Eugenitoriani. I love that name. It basically means daughter of Wellborn. So there's Larry's daughter. And Octavius Apollonius, and I've called him Val because he never actually gives his full, the second in his cognomina. So I've called him Val just to make up for it. Calling him Var sounds a little bit like Dracula, so I called him Val. However, This should not be interpreted as requisite given the range of coins struck by Hieronymus, who probably came directly after Claudia Eugenitoriani in sponsoring the coins. He doesn't pronounce citizenship anywhere. So it wasn't a requirement to produce it. Now, this is the coinage of Claudia Eugenitoriani, and I've assigned largely in negotiation with the lists that have been put together by Michel Amandri and others in Roman Provincial Coinage 3, given how much value could be assigned to these coins. This is the big one. And unusually for the rest of the coins that come after in Colossae, Claudia Eugenitoriani is recognising that Colossae is part of the senatorial province of Asia, not the imperial province of Asia. So the emperor comes next. And I find it particularly interesting that not only is Hadrian, given a brief title, but Hadrian is wedded with Athena with the peaceful lowering of the shield, but very strikingly holding an owl. Unique in provincial coins of this period, except for Alexandria. Usually, when it's in that sort of stylistic, Athena is holding Nike as an affirmation, I think, of Hadrian. And then we come down to the demos. Now, Katerina Martin has done a brilliant service by looking at the role of the demos coins in the bronze mintage of the various cities of Asia. And she thinks that this emphasis on the demos shifts it from the institution of the demos within a city to the citizenry at large, and thereby fulfills the function of the populusque of the Senatus Populusque Romanorum. So what you've got there is the people acting as the bridge to their own culture. So you will see frequently in coin books a distinction being made between imperial coinage and pseudo-autonomous coinage. It's all one currency system. But the iconography reflects a shift. Now, the next couple follow the same process with just a little tweak, because in 129, Hadrian went on a little tour of all the Zeus cities of Asia. It's called the Pan-Hellenic Tour. He made the mistake of taking his wife with him. So what did they have to do? They had to bring in another coin to honour Sabina. Now, what I find interesting with this is that, yes, you've still got your five-fold breakdown, but Sabina comes in with a smaller size than what you've actually got for the demos. There's something being said here about her relationship in this whole sweep of things. The combining of imperial and local cultural conventions, and we see it also on Val's coinage, where he's now got Sabina. We know that Val's coinage actually probably came after Hieronymus, because he actually puts as his biggest coin Aelius, appointed 138, died before Hadrian, but he's still got a coin at Colossae. Anyway, the combining of imperial and local cultural conventions can be seen also in the extended cursus honorum of an unknown Colossian leader who held the annual Roman ratified office of Ekdikos, a key ceremony of the Good News Festival, and delegate at provincial celebrations, but he combined that with local offices that functioned under the city's Hellenistic constitution. Now here, a quick aside to Claudia. We're back with her, good. Claudia Eugenitoriani, as the refounder of Colossae's mint, for all that she bears a Roman citizenship that reaches back into the 1st century, she's one of very few women known to have sponsored civic coinage. about 32 in all women, and there's 2,200 men who've sponsored coins. But the majority of those women sponsors of coins come from Phrygia. And she is the first and last known at Colossae. Even though Eugenia Toriani consistently parades her Roman citizenship, even on her smallest coins, she is visible as the instigator of Colossai's new mint in continuity from a Phrygian inheritance of women's visibility in public affairs, somewhat compromising the Romanization advertised in her citizenship. Peter Tonneman's study of Achaemenian women mused over the elevation of the status of Livia as a prompt to the local rise of public participation and notice of elite women in Phrygia. I think he's mistaken. I think rather Phrygia attests a considerably elevated status of women from at least Hellenistic times. We've got a list of these women that from both Hierapolis and Laodicea that have been dated to Hellenistic times. And slowly but surely, if unevenly, this public presentation of women in benefaction and the like was reeled in. In this sense, Claudia Eugenia Toriani reflects an un-Roman socio-political standing, even if her benefaction ensured a continued recognition of citizenship in her family. And it's clear that the selection of the iconography of her two imperial coins is meticulously astute. So to governance and interventions. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome was content to tolerate plural legal systems and jurisdictions. However, the fact that inevitably disputes arose that required adjudication by Rome through one of its instruments, whether it be emperor or proconsul, whatever, indicates that even when local jurisprudence was endorsed, its authority was clearly subject to Roman citizenship. Hadrian's letter to the Aphrodisians may have been specific to that free city, but it has echoes across the empire, namely that Rome encouraged the solution of local problems under local jurisdictions and laws. Interpolis disputes were able to summon Roman jurisprudential action, but only if such disputes involved city citizens, what he called Greeks in his edict to Aphrodisias. There was no standard pattern between cities in their cultivation or avoidance of Roman oversight. However, it seems clear that Colossae had no desire to follow Laodicea's determined sycophancy of Rome. Apart from the problematic issue of the distinction between the fiscus and Timaeon, which can't get into, it's even more complicated than Chris Forbes on 1 Corinthians 6:9. The legal standing required to access or defer to respective Roman city authority. There are 3 epigraphical examples besides the numismatic witness that indicate Colossi's subjection to the higher authority of Rome. The first is the honorific to Hadrian Olympius, erected at Colossae by the military tribune Lucius Mercato. It complements the special mintings of Hieronymus and Octavius Apollonius Val that honour the emperor's Panhellenic tour and confirms the city's participation in it. But it raises the question of the authority under which Mercato operated. Normally, the authorising body for such installations is the bulle and or the demos, but here there's no indication given. It suggests that Mercato operated under his own, or better, the authority of the imperial entourage, however willing the city may have been for the pedestal, its inscription, and likely a bust or statue. The second piece of evidence is the only Latin inscription so far known from Colossae. It's all significant given that it's only in the 4th century that we see one. But more important is the pedestal on which it was cut. The pedestal was a reused one, originally belonging to a memorial monument erected by a woman under the authority of the bulle and the demos. It suggests that the increased narrowing of what was included under the category of res religiosae, religious things, had impacted on Colossian law, at least after the Constitutio Antoniniana. Whatever perpetuity the woman initiating the memorial may have hoped for in its annual recognition, apparently it lasted only 50 or 70 years, because the emperors came in and they took the pedestal and wrote a Latin inscription, or had a Latin inscription written on the back. The third piece of evidence is critical because it places the pedestal of this woman with its early 3rd century inscription in dialogue with a second memorial known from Colossae, this one erected under a legal instrument called a diataxis. Here, the status differences between equestrian senatorial families on the one hand and a local woman whose husband hadn't even acquired Roman citizenship are very much reflected in the subtle differences in the mention of bulle, council, demos, popular assembly in both inscriptions. In the earlier memorial, the bulle and demos simply honour a young equestrian according to a detailed arrangement made by the deceased's father and overseen by a member of the famous Asini senatorial family of Asia. Here, Rome is very publicly present. The authority of key civic institutions is absent, nothing more than conduits for the intentions of the Roman elite. By contrast, the later memorial indicates the necessary operations of those same civic institutions when a local citizen is the applicant. Significantly, however, this memorial postdates 212, the Constitutio Antoniniana, and yet it's still operating under the local laws. It seems that the status of the persons in the second but earlier memorial invited deference from city institutions, whereas the deference to be displayed in the first memorial actually it meant that she had to apply and defer to those city institutions. Well, very quickly, just to finish with the onomastics, or what can names tell us? Pliny the Younger says, get Roman, and Apollonius of Tyana says, you have got to be kidding. In a letter to Calpurnius Fabatus, Pliny muses that the increase of Roman citizens benefited not only the empire, but was the most secure ornament of cities. Arnaud Besson considers that the continued holding of Roman citizenship in family succession for local polis citizens was contingent on the maintenance of munificent activity. This is important. Just because you got Roman citizenship once as a local citizen did not mean that that continued. You had to continually show your benefaction that benefited the city for that to be understood. Eventually, of course, it got locked in, as with Claudia Eugenitoriani. Somewhere between Pliny and Apollonius come the homonyms of the New Testament and its world. That is, names that are shifted towards the forms existing in the dominant cultures, Rome and Greek. We've heard of one today, Saul, Paul. The letter to the Colossians itself has at least one instance. A certain Jesus, whose Semitic name has been shifted homonymously to Justus. One might want to add Paul into that list from the beginning of Colossians. I like to call him Titch. But it raises, oh, you didn't get the joke, damn. But it raises the question of what indications of identity and identification can be drawn from the names, especially in terms of the impact of Rome. We're very fortunate that for all the limited number of materials that we have from Colossae, we have two big ones. The one on the left, honouring Corimbus for repairing the baths and the water infrastructure, but followed by a 30-line succession of names. And then on the one on the right is a curse tablet from a village near modern-day Kukluk that actually has also a long list of names that are cursed. And so it gives us the opportunity to look at those names and draw some deductions. Now, I haven't got time to go into them, but I have left you with the list of both the names and the Roman citizens on the back, and I can see time's running away. So I'll go straight to the conclusion. There very quickly, 13 or 14 Roman names, 5 status levels, 20 Roman citizens, 2 double cognomina, Greek to Roman. That's interestingly, Latin suffix ianos in iana has crept in. By the 2nd century, made no difference particularly, but originally meant son or daughter of. Marcos is everywhere and has lost any Roman connection at all. But what is important is that there is a progression from Phrygian to Greek names in the genealogies on that big pillar. And from servile Roman to Greek, where there was an opportunity, they got rid of servile background. High-ranking officers without Roman citizenship, they are there. We've got an Apphia, another Apphia at Colossae, and she's a leader of the imperial cult. No Roman citizenship. So she's able to do that quite happily. Conclusion, 3 responses can be emphasised. Oh, don't worry about Phil the Greek. 3 responses. Firstly, the Romanisation of a Greek polis such as Colossae was gradual, with significant aspects of its local life continuing beyond the 3rd century. Secondly, no one city is identical in the pattern and process of Romanisation. There are considerable differences between, for example, Laodicea and Colossae. Thirdly, Colossai's careful curation of its Greek identity and its willingness to retain for a time some particular elements of its Phrygian past, such as the leadership of women, demonstrates that for most of its inhabitants, life continued on as a Greek city. What does this mean for New Testament study? I've given you 6 to look at. I'll go back to it because time I can see has really run out. And I want to thank you very much. Blah, blah, blah. If you want more, look at that. All right. Thank you.
I've really run out of time.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm just interested in the coin where Athena is holding the owl, which you indicated is...
It's not there. All you've got, you mean my calling him Val?
No, the coin where Athena is holding the owl.
Oh, yes,
in hand.
yes.
You mentioned that is the only example apart from Alexandria. And does that indicate an Alexandrian influence at all?
Not necessarily, because the main incidents of those coins at Alexandria belong to Trajan. Now, the moment you recognise that, for those of you who know the early history of Hadrian, Hadrian had a little bit of difficulty trying to persuade people that Trajan had adopted him as Caesar to succeed him. And so by having the owl in that particular iconography associated with Hadrian, they're drawing an iconographic tie with Trajan, thereby saying Hadrian is the authentic successor. Hadrian is the authentic successor to Trajan.
Right. Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.
Come back and see.